a kitchen knife, embedded in her neck, left there, deliberately, like a signature. The apartment was locked from the inside. No broken windows. No forced door. No sign that anyone had entered, or left, at all. And for 30 years, that impossibility was all investigators had. Then a letter arrived, and someone made a fatal mistake. Madison, Maine. Winter, 1961. A small mill town where everyone knows everyone, where routines are predictable, and where a young woman walking home alone should have been perfectly safe. Kathryn Kane is 24 years old. People who know her call her Sue. She is quiet, steady, the kind of person who keeps to herself without being unfriendly. She has her own apartment, a rare piece of independence for a young woman in that era, and she takes pride in it. She locks her door at night. She is careful. It doesn't matter. On a bitter morning in 1961, someone finds her. Inside her apartment. The door is still locked. The windows are intact. There is no evidence that anyone broke in. And yet, she is gone. And the kitchen knife that ended her life is still there, as if whoever left it wanted it to be found. The scene tells investigators two things immediately. 1. Sue Kane knew how to protect herself. She locked that door. 2. Whoever did this either had a key, or she let them in herself. The community fractures. Madison is the kind of town where tragedy travels fast, where grief is communal and suspicion is suffocating. Neighbors look at neighbors differently now. Men who knew Sue, men who passed her on the street, men who worked alongside her, all of them suddenly exist inside a question mark. Police canvass the area. They interview. They knock on doors. They search. They find nothing. No fingerprints that lead anywhere. No witnesses who saw anything. No one who can explain the locked door, the untouched windows, the impossible entry. The murder weapon is catalogued, bagged, stored. It offers no answers, not yet. Because in 1961, the science to ask the right questions of physical evidence simply does not exist. The case is open. Then it is cold. Then it is nearly forgotten. But the knife stays in evidence storage. And Sue Kane's name stays in the file. The 1960s pass. The 1970s. The 1980s. Detectives who worked the original case retire. Some pass away. The file grows thin, not because the evidence disappeared, but because there was nowhere left to take it. Every lead had gone cold. Every suspect had either been cleared or had simply dissolved back into the fabric of ordinary life. And this is where Scott Grimm enters the picture. Scott Grimm is not a name that appears in the original 1961 investigation. There is no smoking gun connection, no photograph of him standing outside Sue Kane's building, no witness who places him there that night. What there is geography, and time, and the kind of quiet, unremarkable presence that makes someone invisible in exactly the right way. Grimm has connections to the area. He moves through the region across the decades, his life intersecting with the landscape of Madison in ways that, individually, mean nothing, and collectively, begin to suggest something. By the time 1990 arrives, the case of Kathryn Sue Kane is 29 years old. Cold cases in that era rarely come back. Without a confession, without a witness, without a deathbed admission, they simply calcify, unsolved, unresolved, a permanent wound in a community's memory. Then the letter arrives. Sometime in 1990, a newspaper receives a piece of mail. The return address identifies the sender only as a concerned citizen. The letter is handwritten. It is detailed. It describes the circumstances of Sue Kane's case with a precision that stops investigators cold. Not the kind of details that appeared in newspaper coverage at the time. Not the broad strokes that anyone who followed the story in 1961 might remember. Specific details. Interior details. The kind of details that only two categories of people know, investigators, and whoever was in that apartment. The letter is turned over to law enforcement. And now the question shifts entirely. The question is no longer just who ended Sue Kane's life. The question is, who wrote this letter? And why? Why would someone write to a newspaper about a 3-decade-old case? Why surface now, in 1990, when everyone had moved on. Is this a confession wrapped in false concern? A taunt? A guilty conscience that finally cracked under the weight of 30 years? Or is it something stranger, someone who witnessed something in 1961 and is only now finding the courage to speak? Investigators examined the letter with everything available to them in 1990. It yields something remarkable. The envelope is sealed the old-fashioned way, with saliva. And saliva contains biological material. At that moment, in 1990, DNA technology exists, but it is still in its early, limited form. The forensic science that would eventually unlock this case has not yet matured. The letter is preserved. The envelope is preserved. The biological material on the seal is catalogued. And then investigators do something that requires either tremendous patience or tremendous faith. They wait. Here is what changes everything. DNA technology does not stand still. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, the science advances at a pace that would have seemed like science fiction to the detectives who first stood in Sue Kane's locked apartment. Databases grow. Techniques sharpen. The amount of biological material required to build a genetic profile drops dramatically. Cases that were forensically impossible to solve in 1985 become solvable in 2005. Cases that were impossible in 2005 become solvable in 2015. The evidence from Sue Kane's case, the letter, the envelope, the biological material preserved from her clothing, waits in storage through all of it. At some point, investigators return to the evidence with the tools of a later era. They extract a DNA profile from the saliva on that sealed envelope, a genetic signature, unique as a fingerprint, pulled from a letter that was never meant to be a confession. They run it against available databases. They cross-reference it against the biological evidence recovered from Sue Kane's clothing, material collected in 1961 and preserved across 3 decades. The profiles match. The man who wrote that letter, the concerned citizen, who reached out to a newspaper in 1990 with intimate knowledge of a 1961 case, left his DNA on the envelope. And that DNA matches genetic material from the scene of Sue Kane's death. The name that emerges, Scott Grimm. 30 years after Sue Kane was found in her locked apartment. 29 years after the investigation went cold. Decades after anyone in Madison, Maine might have believed this case would ever be resolved. A sealed envelope brings it all down. Scott Grimm is located. He is charged in connection with the death of Kathryn Sue Kane. The case moves through the legal system carrying the weight of its own extraordinary history, a 1961 case, a 1990 letter, a DNA match from biological material preserved across generations of forensic science. It is, in its own way, a testament to something. That evidence does not expire. That a case file sitting in a storage room for decades is not a dead end, it is a debt, waiting to be collected. But here is where the story refuses to fully close. Because there is still the locked door. Every investigator who has looked at this case, in 1961, in 1990, in the years after the DNA match, has had to confront the same foundational problem. Sue Kane's apartment showed no signs of forced entry. Her door was locked. Her windows were intact. And yet someone was inside. How? 3 theories have circulated among those who have studied the case. The first, she let him in. If Scott Grimm was known to Sue Kane, if he was a neighbor, an acquaintance, a figure she recognized, she may have opened that door herself, without suspicion, without alarm. Small towns create false senses of safety. A familiar face at the door late at night might not have triggered the caution a stranger would have. If this is true, it means the locked door was never a mystery of access, it was a mystery of trust, broken in the worst possible way. The second, he had a key. Apartments in 1961 did not have the security infrastructure of today. Landlords had keys. Neighbors had keys. Building staff had keys. Duplicate keys were made without oversight, without records. If Grimm had obtained a copy, through relationship, through opportunity, through circumstances we may never fully reconstruct, he would have been able to enter and exit without leaving a mark of forced entry. He could have locked the door behind him. He could have walked away in the dark, leaving behind a scene that looked impossible because the mechanism was invisible. The third theory is the one that unsettles investigators most, that the answer is something we haven't identified, that the specific method of entry remains genuinely unknown, lost to time and the limitations of what 1961-era investigators could document and preserve. And then there is the psychological question that no DNA match can answer. Why the letter? In 1990, Scott Grimm, if he is the author, chooses to write, to reach out, to put details on paper that only he would know, seal the envelope, and send it to a newspaper. What drives a person to do that? Guilt that has compounded across 3 decades. A desire to be caught that he cannot consciously acknowledge. An arrogance, a belief that after 30 years, the science doesn't exist to trace him. Or something more fractured, a mind that needed the case to remain present, that could not let the silence be final. We don't know. The letter exists. The DNA exists. The match exists. But the interior of Scott Grimm's reasoning in 1990, the emotional architecture of what drove him to put that letter in the mail, that remains in shadow. Kathryn Sue Kane was 24 years old in 1961. She had her own apartment in a small Maine town, and she locked her door at night because she understood, in the way that young women always understand, that the world required caution. She was careful. And she was still taken. For 30 years, her case was a locked room in every sense of the word, a mystery sealed against resolution by the limits of the era and the silence of the one person who knew the truth. It took a letter written by a man who perhaps wanted to be found. It took decades of advancing science. It took investigators who refused to let the evidence expire. The knife was left at the scene like a signature. In the end, it was a different kind of signature, microscopic, invisible, pressed to an envelope in 1990, that finally spoke. But here is the question that this case leaves permanently open. That locked door. No forced entry. No broken window. A 24-year-old woman who understood enough about the world to secure her apartment, and yet someone was inside. Key, trust, something we haven't considered. And why did it take a letter, written 29 years after the fact, to finally crack this case? If Scott Grimm hadn't reached out in 1990, if that envelope had never been sealed, never been mailed, never been preserved, would we still be here, asking the same questions? What do you think was Scott Grimm's method of gaining access to that locked apartment? And why do you believe it took so long, 30 years, a letter, and a revolution in science, to finally bring this case to light? Comment below.